add value to your business, or do you want to just be this administrative person?
And often if you look at your talent team and the caliber of talent in your company, they correlate.
You could hire the best person for the job if they were in your candidate pool.
All these individual employees, one by one, together, their voices all come together to articulate the culture of the company.
This is
Hiring on all cylinders.
Hello, podcast land. Welcome back to Hiring on All Cylinders, your favorite recruiting podcast. I am, as always, Rob Stevenson here to guide you through the rough and tumble lifestyles of the eager talent acquisition pros of today and tomorrow, for that matter. To wit, I am joined by Entelo senior business recruiter, Amina Valuad Moinadine. Amina, good to see you.
Rob, it's great to be back.
Yeah, I'm glad you're back in here with me. It feels right.
It does feel right. Thanks for inviting me again.
Yeah, it's been too long. I've been doing a lot of one-off episodes here in the middle of the day. You're hard to book.
I'll always make time for hiring I will always make time for hiring.
Easy for you to say.
Hey, I moved things around for today, and then I was late, but that's okay.
You made it happen. Yeah, so Amina Valuad Moinadine, also known as Amina Impossible to Book Moinadine, but today you made it happen. So glad you're here. We'll catch up with you in a minute, but I don't want to leave our guest waiting in the wings. We have an extra special return guest today, former head of talent for Entelo, Hiring on All Cylinders OG panelist, star of 50 episodes, Vivek Reddy. Vivek, welcome back to the show.
Was it really 50 episodes?
It was 47.
Nice, Rob. Well, thank you for having me back. You know, it took you a full year until you finally invited me, but hey, you know what?
I mean,
it's never too late.
You spent a good amount of that time just being a jobless vagabond gallivanting across Europe. So I didn't know how much recruiting stuff you'd have to talk about.
You know, I might have been recruiting throughout Europe.
Were you?
What were you recruiting for?
Not at all.
Yeah,
maybe for personal reasons.
Which app were you using to recruit?
Scratch that one.
So anyway, you're back in the business now. You've got a job as not the head of talent of Segment, as you told me earlier.
Yep.
What is your role exactly?
Yeah. So to give some context, so after I left Entelo, I kind of thought a lot about what it is I wanted to work on, and there was a couple problem areas within the talent space that I thought was pretty important, and specifically around analytics, how to measure this stuff at scale, and also just thinking about organizations as they're scaling up pretty aggressively, and how does the people side of things treat themselves operationally just as well as the entire revenue side of the business. So what I've effectively carved myself out for within Segment is to more or less be the kind of demand gen expert, except in the people function. So what that means is, how do we set up all of our systems in a way where we can measure things effectively? How do we actually measure all of our people initiatives properly? So like things on either recruiting side or the people side of things. And then lastly, how do we just funnel as many highly qualified candidates as we possibly can for all of our roles, so that we can make sure that we continuously hire effectively and do that at scale.
Okay, so how is that different than a head of talent?
So it's less about managing the actual recruiting function. So I'm not overseeing people that are actually closing roles or anything like that. I have been doing a little bit of that myself recently, but that's been more out of just necessity as opposed to what my actual longer term fit's going to be. But the difference is this is way more operational and systems focused, as opposed to the people side and closing candidates and managing other recruiters.
Okay, so you're more like a strategic individual contributor.
Yes. Yeah.
Okay.
That actually is probably exactly the way that I would view it today.
Okay. Well, you can steal that. That's a free one.
Yeah.
How are you starting to think about these problems?
That's a really good question. So super high level, there's a couple things that are quick wins for us. So things like branding initiatives, and then how to measure branding effectiveness. So for example, if we have a blog which has been performing pretty well for us, how do we understand what the impact of that blog is in terms of qualified candidates coming into our pool, and specifically for engineering? So understanding how to measure that stuff and what levers to pull to increase qualified pipe. And then just all the different assets that are required throughout an entire candidate lifecycle. So for example, blog posts at the very top, which can at least get some people attracted towards segment, but also events, any sort of nurturing campaigns in between. How can we think about all of that entire funnel and how we can augment every step of that entire recruiting process with things that you would view almost exactly the same way as within content and or demand gen side of things. That's the initial like jumping off point. The other part too is just like, how do you measure this stuff properly? And I think this is probably my guess is most people deal with this issue, which is measuring things within your ATS or your HRIS is a gigantic mess. Like Greenhouse, I took a look at it for us initially, and I literally had to go in there and clean up the whole damn thing. This included all of our interview stages. We had 40 at one point, which didn't make any sense. Well, it's things like even minor naming differences result in them being different stages.
Yeah. So like hiring manager phone screen, lowercase.
Or it's like
exactly.
Gotcha.
Or it's like third stage - onsite. If there's a space between the onsite, that becomes a different thing than if there's no space. So it's like all these minor little quirks, and then because the underlying thing is, and this is why it's systems analytics as well as top of funnel, is to measure things effectively, your systems have to be set up in a way that actually allow you to do that. This is exactly what we dealt with in the early days with HubSpot and Salesforce and all of that. So it's making sure that we set up things properly so that we have very consistent methodologies for how we measure every single role. And then from there, then we have a very systematic approach to measuring, to understanding where there are gaps, and then like we can be far more data driven about understanding where we have inefficiencies and where we don't.
Okay, so what are some of the things like specifically that Segment was having trouble measuring? It sounds like across the board pipeline, but like were there specific metrics or things that you're like, all right, here are the first three things, like, hey, we don't know at what rate people are progressing. That's just, I'm riffing an example. What were the kind of things you wanted to iron out first? Yeah,
there was one particularly major thing that we wanted to get measured properly. The biggest thing was, so we have really been trying to drill down into engineering hiring specifically, because that is like a pretty big strategic initiative for us. Company is more or less doubling for this upcoming year, and actually more than doubling within engineering. So it's like there's just a ton of emphasis there, and it's probably gotten tougher on that side of things in the last year. There was a little bit of a blip, I thought, where engineering was okay, where recruiting for it got a little bit easier, but that's completely shifted again. All of the big companies are doing well, and those are the types of people that we want to go after, like folks from Facebook, Amazon, Google, etc. So this was really, really strategic for us. The part that we needed to understand was how many hours were we actually spending per hire, and specifically how many hours were engineers spending on this. So this was like not particularly the cleanest thing in the world. Like you'd think that the data would be very easy to grab, but if your stages aren't like aligned properly, if you don't clearly know exactly how much time people are spending at every stage, or even like post the ATS part of it, like just hours people are spending closing, like looking at calendars and all of that, it wasn't particularly clear.
It's all in a million different places.
Exactly. So me and one of our engineers, we spent a little bit of time working on this to at least come up with a couple different approaches for measuring this. So we actually have now drilled it down to understanding exactly, or at least I'd say probably within 10%, how many hours we're spending per quarter of engineering time for every hire that we make. So it's actually been trending very positively, which is good. And this is really important because it helps govern a lot of our decisions around recruiting. So for example, are we passing too many people off to phones, to like tech screens? Are we passing too many people off to on-sites? How much time are we spending on closing? Like these are all things that are incredibly important for us to know, so we can just drive more efficiency and understand like where are the gaps, what can we do better, and then where can we devote more of our resources for.
So what did you learn? How much time were your engineers spending interviewing?
A couple lessons that we learned, so our close rates are decent. I wouldn't say they weren't excellent. They've been trending highly positively recently.
What's a good close rate?
Engineering side, honestly, I'd say anything above 50% is probably at least decent. I think realistically, like if you can be around 60, that's good.
I guess if you get someone to the offer stage, there's a pretty high, like usually if they're not going to accept, they would drop out sooner in the process, right?
Yeah. At the same time, it's that's what you would think, but then you have to craft a process that weeds that out earlier. So, you have to set things up in a way where you can catch people that may not be as interested, and then not invest, and then make sure that you're sussing out like true intent earlier. And that's both for them as well for us, right? It's like, it doesn't make sense for them to spend 5-10 hours going through interview processes for them to just say no to someone either. So
what kind of, sorry, I keep cutting you off to ask different follow-up questions. Okay. What are the things you try and suss out early in the process to find out if someone's not going to ultimately assess the offer, or if it's not a good fit, or whatever that process is?
Yeah, I think one of the big things that I like to focus, so I actually have been doing a good amount of frontline recruiting for us, so I've had to deal with this a little bit recently. Major thing is really motivations, as well as just how are they even thinking about their job process? Like, if people are talking to 10, 15 companies, so we saw this a little bit with people that were coming from agencies and or the like services that offer multiple different companies for each candidate. We were noticing that oftentimes they just weren't very directed about what they actually wanted. So that was just resulting in us spending a lot of hours without really understanding and sussing out like exactly what was this person looking for, and like what was driving their entire decision making, like what was the type of environment they even wanted to be in. Yeah. So we kind of front loaded a lot of those types of conversations into the initial recruiter screen. So this is actually one thing I think we do a really good job at, which is digging in, really understanding like, what are you looking for? Why are you talking to us? What are the things that you're looking for in your entire career? Like, how do you want to progress? And digging into those areas and understanding, does that actually align with what we have to offer? And if it doesn't, then, it's totally fine to just be like, hey, you know what? Like, if you're not sure where you're at today, go through your process and then come back to us if you feel as if you still haven't figured out what you want, and then we're happy to talk. But we just don't think it makes sense for either of us to like spend a lot of time if neither of us are really sure about what we're looking for. So I find that type of approach can actually be okay, and actually puts a little more pressure on the candidate to do some more homework.
Right, and narrow their process down and decide, like, do I want to continue down this role? Yeah,
exactly. And then I think the other part too is it just helps them. The side benefit is when you kind of pull away a little bit, a lot of times people will be like, wait, why? Well, actually, that is what I want.
Is that ever a difficult conversation? Because it's almost like you were asking these critical questions, and the subtext, which anyone will pick up on, is we're not sure that you either A, really want this, or B, are a good fit. And so you're having that like early in the process, but you're not saying this is over. Is that ever like an uncomfortable conversation to have with people? It seems like it's kind of like a little bit of a slap.
Yeah, I think sometimes it can be uncomfortable, but I would rather have that conversation earlier than invest 10 hours on both sides and then have it down the road. So to me, it's a pretty easy trade-off. It's if a candidate for whatever reason feels turned off by it, like, hey, you know what, like, yeah, then maybe we weren't the right fit for you. And that's okay. But I'm usually very nice about it. It's just like, hey, like, this is a mutual process. We want to make sure that we set you up for long-term success. But at the same time, if you're not sure what you want, like, our environment is a fast-moving one where we're growing quickly, and we need everyone to be, to have a lot of camaraderie and to be on the same page. And, for us, that's extremely important. So, we would love to have you here. Like, I think that there's a lot of potential, but if you're not 100% sure, take your time. Like, it's very important for you to suss this out for your own good. And that's where, like, I might offer like some personal story of mine, like in a scenario which I've dealt with where I was dealing with something personally that was similar. And I find that when I can humanize it a little bit and start to empathize, then people usually are quite favorable.
Yeah, it makes sense. And the more I hear you talk about it, the more that kind of clicks, where it's a consultative approach, right? I think most people's, especially tech talent's, experience with recruiters is that, like, we want you really bad, we want to get you through the process, we hope you work here. And if you take a step back and say, you know what, I want you to come here because it's a good move for you, and it's because it's what you want, not because you have the ability to do the job. And that's it.
And to weave all this back, this is the reason why we wanted to measure that, like, time spent for every single hire, was because this helped us uncover and paint and have data to back our stories as to why we were approaching things differently. So it's like, oh, we're spending all of this time and we're getting people that still aren't bought in. Wait a second, like let's peel back a little bit. Let's dig that out earlier. And now like pipelines have gotten significantly more efficient. Our internal goal is to try to get ourselves to a close rate of about 80%, which is really high. And given the types of people that we've been going after, like it's extremely ambitious. But honestly, like we're spending more of our time with people that are pre-bought in on us, and it's better for us, and it ends up being better for candidates too, and they're getting a much higher touch experience. So it's literally working for everyone, and it's not that different from sales, right? Like on the sales side of things, when you're closing deals, you want to be focusing on deals that are more ready to close, and the more often that you do that, the higher the likelihood that you're going to hit your number. So similarly within recruiting, it is you want to spend your time on high value people that are ready and bought in. And the more time that you spend on that, the more results that you're going to have. Whereas I find that most companies are spending a lot of their times going after people that are not bought in, that they try to push through for whatever various reason, and that results in pretty bad inefficiencies.
Yeah.
So, but it's hard to understand what those inefficiencies are until you measure it.
Of course, yeah.
Which is a large part of what I'm trying to accomplish.
Gotcha.
How are you able to take this information and guide hiring managers?
Yeah. So for example, right, we like look at our close rate, and let's say that for a month that it or like for like a couple months it was 50%. So okay, that's lower than what we'd like, and even by just raising that close rate by 10%, you know what, that might end up being 20 less hours spent per hire per, you know, for all engineers. That's very tangible. So then we can go to a hiring manager and be like, hey, let's figure out how we can close at a higher clip. So let's look at the entire process, understand what levers that we can pull, so that we can improve that close rate, and let's measure that, and let's see if that actually impacts hours spent. So that was like one approach that we took. Another thing might be, hey, wait a second, like for like a lot of the people that were getting past tech screens, they were, failing at like, let's say, at the on-site stage. Okay, is our tech screen good enough? Like, are we testing for the right things? Are there opportunities there to like maybe, to like change that up a little bit and or improve what that looks like so we can get a little bit better signal going in? Or is there like an additional lightweight step that we can include that gives us more signal? So it's all about just like understanding how can we gather more information so we can be more efficient throughout process. And oftentimes that actually correlates really well with the entire candidate experience too, because then candidates feel like, you know what, like they're not wasting my time. They're trying to figure out if this is a good fit. And we try very hard to be open and like transparent throughout. So I think like as long as you're being very open about why you're making decisions, why you're moving people through the steps that they are, and you understand how those steps impact the downstream effects. So both like close rates, which then impacts all the way back upstream to like hours spent by recruiters or hours spent by engineers. That really gives very clear perspective as to, hey, how do we think about this holistically, and where are the areas that we should focus on for the next couple months where we can really drive a ton of impact. And all of this matters when you're scaling fast, because every efficiency gain ends up resulting in very material impact. Yeah. Like that means multiple hires. That means significantly less time, and you need a smaller team to achieve better results.
I feel like we're wasting your expertise over there. You ask amazing follow-up questions, which I love you for, but I want to hear. I don't want to just hear you badger Vivek as much as I love doing that. I'm curious if you, in your phone screens or in process with candidates, if you've ever noticed what Vivek's noticing, which is, this person is interviewing at a lot of companies. We're one of 15. How can I go about figuring out if they're the kind of person who, if we get all the way through the process, is going to end up saying yes? Yeah,
absolutely. And I think that I've seen that that's a little bit more common of seeing candidates interviewing with 15 to 20 companies on the technical side, whereas more on the business side, I, at least from my experience, have noticed candidates are probably talking to between 4 to 6 companies, so it's not as high volume. But I think it, just like what Vivek said, it's so important to be qualifying up front. And I'm actually starting to do this even harder and stronger with enterprise candidates as I'm hiring for enterprise roles here. And we recently hired Wolf, who's our head of enterprise sales, and him and I are having lengthy conversations about how we want to qualify up front. And it's a lot of just, listen, this is what our compensation is. This is what the opportunity is. It's a little bit more playing hardball, which I haven't done as much before, and I'm starting to do it now. Do you want to be here? Are you okay with coming into the office every single day? I'm not going to sugarcoat what the opportunity is. This is what it really is. This is what our op is. This is where we're good. This is where we're still building things. And I want to make sure that you know up front that this is what it is. If you have a conversation with Wolf, are you ready for coming into an opportunity like that? I also really want to be mindful of my hiring manager's times. And Wolf, as a new manager, new head of enterprise sales, he has a team that he's building out. We're opening up a New York office, so he's working on that as well. He just has a lot going on. So I want to make sure that every 45-minute screen that he's taking on is something that's worthwhile for his time. And that means if I'm putting you in front of Wolf, that means you're interested and you actually want to assess this conversation. And I'm sure, Vivek, you've noticed this as well. Passive candidates are tricky for that, right? We're reaching out to them, we're getting them interested, we're pitching them. So there have been many times, and this was actually feedback that Sam, our VP of sales, gave me. He said, hey, in the last batch of candidates that I was talking to before Wolf started, spoke with a lot of really great people, but they ended up being like, hey, actually, you know what? I'm not ready to make a move right now. Or now that after I thought about it, after our conversations, I'm not looking to make a move in the next 2 months. Maybe let's connect again. So what I've changed my approach is that even if they're a source candidate, they need to be ready to actually interview with us before I'm putting them in front of the hiring managers, which is going to take away a lot of their time. Networking is obviously great. We want to build a brand. We want to be talking to great people, regardless if they're ready to interview right now or not. But I need to be mindful of our team's time.
Yeah, absolutely. And I know you said it was something that you weren't doing and were working on, but right before we started recording, I heard you doing it. You were on the phone with an EAE candidate, and you were like, is this something that you'd be interested in? I think it was actually after you finished explaining what we do and how we're positioned in the HR tech marketplace, and you're like, okay, is that a exciting opportunity to you, right? Is that something that you want to hear more about? Like,
yeah,
and like just to, if they're like, nah, well, HR tech, man, I don't know, like, then you're like, okay, well, no, thanks for your time.
Exactly. And even, my time is really valuable too. I have a lot of things going on, and I don't
want to podcasts to do,
running late for this. And I don't want to be spending 30 to 45 minutes on a candidate if they aren't actually interested in exploring. I love talking to people. I love meeting new people. I love telling them about what we're doing here, but it's a waste of time for them and for me if there's zero reason to be exploring right now.
Yeah, absolutely. Vivek, you said you're not actually doing any like frontline sourcing or like recruiting. You're all processes based, or like did sound like you were. Yeah. If you're assessing in the process, we need to suss out for people who aren't leaning in sooner. Are you having those conversations though?
So I've been in a capacity where I've been filling in around technical recruiting recently. So like the team is not like fully built up to the point that we would like just yet. And it's also just because we're trying to be particularly strict about who it is that we bring on board as like as a reasonably senior technical recruiter. So in the interim, it's actually been very good for me to be hands-on. So I've been owning a good chunk of our like senior like back-end infrastructure type of engineers, as well as there's a couple strategic roles that like fall to me. So it's been good because I've gotten to see firsthand what do our processes look like, what do the front lines look like, what are the challenges that like recruiters are facing internally, and then that's helping me guide myself for what it is that I want to build from a systems perspective. So today it is, yes, I am being front lines, but I'm thinking a lot about what are the things that I need to build out to like enable all of our entire recruiting team to be more efficient. So for example, that goes from things like sourcing strategies and like softwares and systems that just make it easier to pipe data into Greenhouse or whatever systems we're using, to down the road, like I want to be able to measure like, okay, not only where do our sources come from, but where do our highest performers come from, which is kind of the holy grail, which like very few companies really get to. But that for something like that, you would need both HRIS data as well, or HRIS / like performance review data to be merged alongside recruiting data. So these are like some of the types of questions which I'm asking myself is like, how do you cohesively tie that entire candidate story from when you find people all the way to how do they actually perform within your organization, and then looking back and understanding like what are the commonalities around people that end up becoming excellent employees, where do we make mistakes, what's working, what isn't, where are we actually making hires, where are we not making hires, are there things around the people side of things that we can improve? There's like a whole host of questions that can be improved at. And honestly, like I only think like a handful of companies really attack all of these problems, and it's usually the normal players that you would expect. So Google, Netflix, Facebook, Amazon, etc. Like the big tech companies are usually very good about measuring all these things. And a large part of why I was excited about Segment was they're a data infrastructure company at their heart. They enable analytics across the board, primarily on like the revenue side of things, but they want to apply a lot of those same principles towards the people side. So they had this gap and they want to get better at this, and they were willing to invest in this very early, which is exactly the role that I asked for and what I thought could end up being really material for them. And my pitch was focusing on this today is, generally speaking, probably significantly earlier than most companies ever do. I don't think I've really seen companies invest in this sort of hire probably until 300 plus employees, and even that is reasonably early.
Right, yeah.
But I very clearly articulated to our CEO, these are the benefits that you'll get, and there's almost no downside, because like I will provide you value regardless. These are going to be things which you want to get solved regardless, but the earlier you do it, the more compound benefits there are around hiring faster, not having to build out as large of a tech recruiting team, and we'll just be far more data driven about like everything, right?
Course,
not just the revenue side, but the people side too. So
I mean, part of the reason that it doesn't take place at smaller companies is because to measure employee lifetime and life cycle, you have to have employee lifetime life cycle, right? Like,
yeah, that's
if
fair.
you've had 18 months could be a long time for someone to measure at a startup. You need a few years, right? And so I think once you every not just failed and succeeded candidate, but failed and succeeded employee is an opportunity to recalibrate the interview and selection process, right?
Yeah, but the thing is, like, honestly, if you have 2 years worth of data for HRIS and your ATS system, that's enough data to work off of where you can at least start ballparking things. Yeah, it may not be may not be 100% precise. Like, things will get calibrated over time, and that's okay. Right. But you want some baseline by which you can start measuring, because once you have a baseline, then you can start gearing up to improve. But if you don't know where you stand initially, like that's the problem that I think a lot of organizations face. They don't even know where they stand on like either talent initiatives and or people initiatives. So, and it's because that space in general typically has not gotten anywhere near as large of budgets as like revenue side does.
Of course, yeah.
Which means that there aren't companies that get invested in that solve those types of problems for them. So like there's this entire trickle down effect where that side of the business does not get the same solutions or tools that the revenue side of the business does. So that's, to me, I view that as an opportunity. Like there are things about like from sales or from marketing or from customer success that you can apply towards people/talent initiatives. And as you're doing that, you can learn a lot about how you can measure things effectively and then use that to drive a significantly more effective people organization. So that's kind of the general approach that I was taking, and that's why I was saying that the way that I view my role is actually very much kind of ahead of demand gen, except within the people function. It's about how do we enable systems that allow us to measure things, give ourselves a baseline, and then see trends over time, and then accordingly just get better at everything on our people side of things.
Head of talent demand gen.
Yeah, I still have not figured out a role that makes a lot of sense. The closest thing I've seen is, I think there's a guy at Uber who I believe is actually like one of our one of the people that Entelo that's like Entelo's like biggest advocates. But he's their head of people analytics, and that's probably the closest thing that I can think of that represents the type of work that I'm trying to accomplish for us.
How could you advise companies who aren't doing this, who want to do this, to start doing this?
To like make the business case?
Right.
I was about to ask
exactly.
that, yeah.
Like, how do you start making the business case to really invest in something like this? Because I absolutely 100% see the value in this. And I do think it's a shame that companies don't start earlier on, but based off of resources and budget, it's not something that they're thinking about.
Yeah. This is a large part of why one of the first things that our VP of engineering wanted to measure was engineering hours spent per hire, because that's extremely tangible thing, right? Like that's literally hours like that's like high paying employees hours worth of time. So you can actually quantify how much that equates to the entire business, right? If you're spending 100 hours per engineering hire, like of engineering time per engineering hire, like just think about that, right? Like, I mean, that's just a random number I like tossed out there, but like if it's something like that, at least you have a baseline now, right? So you know, like, you know, let's say they're getting on average paid about $100 an hour or something like that. It's like $100,000 worth of spend, right? Like of literally just engineering time for every hire, and that doesn't factor in all of the recruiting time, any agency fees, like everything else that goes into it. So until you like understand, I think, time that gets allocated, like that's why he made us measure it. So I think that's actually one thing to like take a look at is like if there is one thing to measure, this is the sort of thing that I think resonates very strongly with executive teams is understanding what is the actual cost to my business for us making these hires or for us moving towards these initiatives. And once you get that baseline in place, you can start making very good cases. You can start making monetary claims that's actually reasonably back, even if it's like 10 plus or minus 10%. Or even 20%, it's something. It's something that gives a sense in terms of where your costs are. And as long as you're measuring things consistently, month over month, quarter over quarter, then you can see if you're improving or not. But I find that that's one of the ways that we've really successfully articulated to our executive team as to how we're improving or what we need to do to go improve. So I find that like I think like understanding the actual time and cost of your hires is one of the most important things that you can deal with. So outside of like that and maybe just basic funnel management, so just like understanding ratios from stage to stage, those are probably the basic things. And I think those alone will give you a really good sense of the greater picture and where you can start attacking to improve your process.
What has been the most surprising thing that you've learned?
Oof. Wow, that's a good one. So this is kind of counterintuitive for us, but surprisingly, referrals have not closed at as high of a rate as we would expect.
So you're getting the referrals, but you're not closing the referrals.
Yeah, the close rates are not like materially different, actually, from at least from the last couple quarters that we've looked at. It's not materially different from close rates for other roles. Like actually, surprisingly, recently, like our agency close rates have actually been quite good. But I think I think I can rationalize it. So, and again, this would be a theory. Like this is a theory which I'd want to test. So, so for example, I think with agencies, we go into those conversations very, I'd say like very skeptical. So we are taking a much closer, like much more like close to the vest type of process. So we're really sussing out very aggressively up front. And I think all of that really helps us kind of guide the right people that come from agencies towards us. And the benefit is like we're starting to get a little bit bigger. The brand is getting out there a little bit more. So like people, as they're learning about us, they're getting fired up. So it's been working actually pretty well recently. But we had a period of time where like agency hires or folks from agency, it was like a terrible close rate. And that's where we had to really start rethinking everything. But referrals, I think one of the reasons why it sometimes can lull you is you just assume sometimes that, okay, that people that are getting referred, that they've been pre-vetted a little bit, that they're actually sold in the company, but you actually can't treat them differently. You actually have to treat every single candidate, I think, roughly the same. So you have to take a similar process. And I think that was a lesson that we learned was don't treat referrals differently because they know someone, that's here. You still have to take a pretty like high touch approach. And you should have higher close rates if you treat everything equivalently, but it's very easy to forget that.
Yes, that's so true. Because I mean, this is like almost conventional recruiting wisdom. It's like referrals tend to stay longer and they tend to have a higher close rate. Well, maybe the reason they have a higher close rate is because they have an internal champion right off the bat, right? Who is just like advocating for them the whole way through. Whereas an agency person or someone who doesn't have connections within the company doesn't have that. So I guess in that case of the referral, and I guess that's standard anyway, you remove that person who referred them from the entire process. But like, even though you can remove that referring person from the interview process, they might know other engineers, they might know other people in the company. There's still that connection there. They're going to be a little warmer no matter what. How do you normalize to make sure that you're not treating them more leniently than any other candidate?
Yeah, so, actually, I would actually argue it's not even about the leniency here, right? So I think, well, first off, if you're worried about leniency, the most important thing there is to make sure that you have a process that is very consistent. So that is very consistent for people of every single source possible. So whether they come from agency and or referral, they go through the same steps and they have the same types of people.
We're getting into unconscious bias territory here too,
yes,
right?
Exactly,
yeah.
right? Like, and I
Which
think
is training that you should provide regardless.
Exactly, right? I mean, the most important thing about interviews is like a lot of times they actually do not provide crazy signal. They're not like super highly correlative in terms of performance. But one of the things that you can do to make it at least closer to that is to structure them as much as you possibly can. So like make sure that every single interview is like hyper structured. So either similar interviewers or the interviewers are trained similarly, right? So they're looking for the same things, asking similar questions, so that you can remove as much of that bias as possible. So I think that's one step to at least make sure they're not being too lenient on people that may have come in through friends. The other part though, and this is the part that I was trying to touch on, was with referrals, oftentimes it's easier, because you may want to go more lenient, that actually does yourself kind of a pretty big disservice, because you actually may forget about steps in your process that are actually highly meaningful. So like understanding motivations, what they're looking for, you can skirt by that because you end up having this perspective where you feel like, oh, you know what, things are going to be fine. They're like feeling good about us. But just think about this. They probably have a friend at your company. They may have friends at other companies too, right? Like there's plenty of other places that they're probably looking at. So that's no reason to think of it differently. I think that was a pretty big lesson for us was, I had one bad beat that way. And that really forced me and our hiring manager to rethink that. And we got better. Like we got significantly better out of that. So like we have no talk now, like throughout interview process, about likelihood of someone closing or any of that. Like we don't have any warm, fuzzy type of conversations like that.
Gotcha.
Like we used to be like, oh, you know what? There's a very good likelihood this person's going to close. Like they would only not sign with us, if something happened. Instead, we just focus on our process and are very rigid about that. And we don't we're very strict about not using language that even gives the hint that it's okay to be lenient at any step in that process.
How are you getting the referrals involved?
Yeah.
Or sorry, not the referrer.
Referrers. So this is actually what our head of recruiting does a really good job at. So she really spearheaded this team sourcing initiative, and I think the team sourcing thing was sourcing power hours, which honestly very similar to what I know that Entelo does. Although I know that at Entelo, it's not just, it's true sourcing. It's a lot of times people are actually using product and going and reaching out to new folks. But for us, it really has been dig through your networks, find a bunch of people. This is one thing I'm trying to figure out how to build a proper system or process for is how can we maintain referrals in a place where recruiters can help every single referrer manage that life cycle with that person, because they may list out some folks that they think would be really good fits for us, but maybe are just not ready today. How can recruiters at scale make sure that we're staying on top of that and then helping each and every referrer manage every single candidate that could be a good fit?
Sounds like a marketing.
Exactly,
initiative.
right? This is a system process oriented kind of problem. So this is the sort of thing that very much falls into my bucket of how do I come up with a process here that
talent demand gen.
Exactly. Yeah. Yes.
Well, Vivek, you've had a wonderful homecoming here. I'm sorry it took so long. I wanted to make sure that you had something to talk about.
Tisk, Rob.
Clearly you did.
Yeah,
so I should have had you in here sooner.
Actually been thinking about it for a while, but yes, you know what? It actually might have been a good thing to wait a little bit so I could digest some of this info.
Yeah, exactly. And, let the people miss you a little bit.
Yes, sometimes it is good to play a little bit hard to get so that, candidates come back to you. And
play
likewise,
hardball.
Yeah, just play hardball here.
So too podcast listeners.
So that you come crawling back to me, Rob. Yes.
Yeah. Well, this has been a wonderful episode. Vivek, you're the man. Amina, you're awesome as always. Sorry for not having you in here more. You blow me away every time. You do my job for me. You could host a podcast if you wanted to. I'm completely non-essential here.
Maybe one day I will.
Wink, wink, nudge, nudge. Anyways, all of you out there in podcast land, thank you so much for joining us once more. You've been wonderful, amazing, talented recruiters. I've been Rob Stevenson. Have a spectacular week, and happy hunting.
Thank you.